Hey everyone, welcome back to Crafting Life I Want. A couple months ago, over on Instagram, which you can find me at Crafting Life I Want, I posted a picture of 3 different knife designs, and I asked everyone over there to tell me which one they liked best. Everyone almost unanimously chose design B, which is what you see here. So today we're going to be making this knife, and I'm going to try some new things that I haven't done before, from handle texturing to finishing of the blade. So I hope you'll enjoy learning with me as we go along. So for this knife, I had some leftover 1084 steel that's about 1/4 inch thick that we're going to be using. The first step is we're going to cut out the rough shape on the bandsaw before we head over to the grinder. So at this point, I've got a paper pattern that's just taped to a piece of metal. I could start grinding on it at this point, but metal heats up when you grind. And if I dip that in water at all, it's just gonna fall apart. I won't have any lines to work off of. So what I'm gonna do is hit it with some spray paint. Color doesn't matter at all. This is just some stuff I have lying around. And then I'm gonna hit it with a heat gun to dry it nice and fast. Blue Dykem would work better. I'll get some eventually, just hasn't happened yet. But paint will work in the meantime. I'm using a 24 grit ceramic belt from Carbide Abrasives. This is their shredder line that has been really great for tearing out metal really fast, and I'll be cranking up my grinder to 100%. You want to make sure when you're grinding on ceramic belts that you're pressing hard. The pressure allows them to consistently break away some of the abrasives and expose new stuff. If you press too soft, they'll end up getting crusty and won't be nearly as effective. On my work rest, I'll be grinding the rough profile, and then I'll be flipping it up, and using the flat platen, I'll be grinding the flats on either side to make sure I have flat surfaces to begin with. I'm going to be drilling a 1/4 inch hole in this to serve as a lanyard hole. I'm using WD-40 as my cutting fluid, which isn't great. I do have on my list of things to get is some actual cutting fluid. And then I'm going to be using a countersink bit to just soften up the edges on either side. All right, so at this point, what we're going to do is scribe our lines on the blade. Again, this is a spot where Blue Dykem would be helpful. I'll be using a Sharpie. You don't want to use anything else because, again, you're dipping your knife in water frequently, and something other than Sharpie will wash away. Additionally, I made my own Height Scribe. I used a 123 block and then a Carbide Scribe, and you can get these for about $6 at Lowe's. I just took a bolt through a piece of wood, attached it to the 123 block, drilled a hole angled through it, and then put a bolt through that that's threaded into the wood. And this allows me to clamp this down at a particular location, which allows me to set the height up from my workpiece. And this allows me to slide nice and smoothly on my granite block and mark those lines. This is fairly easy to make. I kind of based it off of a design from Redbeard Ops. You can go check him out. I'll link him in the description below. But you can also use a drill bit. So basically you want to take a drill bit that is a little bit smaller than the thickness of your metal, And then you'll use that drill bit flat on your granite block and run that along the edges. The tip of the drill bit will give you those same lines. So if you look closely here, you'll see that we have two lines instead of just one down the middle. This is the reason why I chose you to choose a drill bit that was slightly smaller than the thickness of your metal, is that it gives you that point that's less than halfway. And then when you flip it over and do the other side, you're getting 2 points of reference. This gives you just a wider area to look at when you're grinding down to it. We'll grind down close to these, but not quite before heat treat. But this will give us reference points that we can look at up through the end of our project when we get down to final sharpening. So my wife got me this Behnke file guide for Christmas, and what it has is a ceramic front here, and ceramic is harder than the belts that I'm using. So it doesn't get worn away when it's up against a belt. So what I'm going to do is put our knife through here, and we're just kind of establishing where I want the bevel to be. So this sharp point here is the end of the blade, so I'm going to line that up, and then just kind of a nice line forward. I'll tighten these down a little bit. Nice, slight angle forward. And it's important not to over tighten these. Like, this isn't a clamp, but it does need to be tight enough so that when you put pressure on it on the belt, it doesn't slide around. So what we're doing at this stage is, because I'm working with 1/4" steel, I have way more metal than I need for the blade. I'm also not doing handle scales on this knife. We're going to do a different texturing on the handle part back here. So what I'm doing at this point is just grinding down pretty flat throughout. I'm aiming for about 1/8 of an inch thick on the blade before we go into final sharpening. So the file guide is there. Everything behind the file guide is still going to say full thickness of 1/4". And then everything up here will be about 1/8 of an inch. And that's why I gave myself the reference points that we just made, so I can grind down to those and try to keep it even on both the front and the back of the blade. right, so that's looking pretty good. My lines are fairly even. They're not perfect, but at this stage, I just wanted to get it a little thinner. The next step is going to be some of the handle treatment. I will give you a nice close-up of kind of what this looks like without the file guide on. I can show you just exactly what a file guide like this can do for your knife making. So I'm going to go ahead and take off this file guide and show you the advantages that it gives you for your knife making. Come on. So it's a little gummy here. I'll just pop that off real quick. What you can see is how even these two lines are and how straight my bevels are up here. Trying to do that freehand without a file guide is extremely difficult. This is actually my first time using the file guide, so even an idiot can do it. So before we move farther down the grinding path, I want to address the handle at this stage. I want to add some texture to it because this is going to be an all-metal knife with no handle scales. What I'm going to do is, while it's cold, I'm going to hit it with a ball peen hammer and just give it a nice hammered texture. It'll give it a lot of nuance once we get it hardened, just with color and bouncing light, and then it'll also give it a texture and a nice finished feel to it, to the final knife. So one of the results of the hammered finish that we just did is that there are some sharp edges where we hit the edges. Now that was on purpose. I was trying to get the entire thing done and end with a slightly rounded edge. But along that note, I'm gonna take my surface conditioning belt and just hit all of those edges real fast. Just kind of round it over a little bit and smooth them out a bit. So the last step that we're going to do before heat treat is add our sharpening choil. I'm just using a chainsaw file. It's fairly simple. You just pick your spot, and I'm choosing the transition from where the blade transitions into the handle. I like to start on an edge. It gives you a reference point for the file to ride in, and then I work my way across. When I'm going through the heat treating process, whether I forge it or go through stock removal, I like to do normalizing cycles. I'm going to go through this cycle 2 times where I bring it up to critical temperature and then let it cool to black, and then on the 3rd time I'll bring it up to critical temperature and then quench it. So I just got done tempering the blade. Now I'm going to start roughing in the bevels on my grinder. I went ahead and grabbed the new 80 grit belt, and I'm going to go ahead and clamp it to my angle iron, which serves as my bevel jig. And this will allow me to run it back and forth, keeping a consistent angle. I've set my platen at a 15-degree angle, which once we account for both sides will give us a 30-degree bevel on the blade. So I'm going to go ahead and get my PPE on and we'll get started. So what I'm grinding to is, I don't know if you can see it here, but the initial lines that we put in are still here from when we were finding our center. And I can just barely make them out, and that's what I'm grinding these bevels to initially. It's looking like, based off of what I'm seeing, I might not make it all the way up the blade with a 30-degree angle. And so I'm gonna have to decide whether or not I wanna decrease the angle a bit to carry that bevel all the way up to the spine, or if I'll just convex it and blend that line in up to the spine. So for now, I'm gonna switch the knife around so it's pointing the other way in my jig, and I'll get started on the other side. So at this point, other than the very tip, I have come down to those two lines we originally drew back to determine the center of our blade. And I'm looking at how high up my bevels are coming, and it looks like I'm going to want to decrease the angle a little bit. Instead of doing 30 degrees total, I'll probably pull that down to 25. And if that doesn't get me all the way up to the spine, I'll just come back with a slack belt towards the end and convex this bevel, and that'll blend that in and clean up all that metal as we move forward. So at this point, we took the angle down to what I think is going to be roughly 22 degrees, and the bevel came up pretty far on this side and didn't come up as far on this side as I wanted it to. So at this point, our blade is still centered. I've come down all the way to that line we talked about earlier on both sides. So I'm actually gonna shift over to the slack belt and start moving up the grits. And that will smooth out this bevel, so there won't be a defined bevel. It'll just be ground all the way up to the spine. And then we'll start moving up the grits and thinning out the blade a bit more. So I adjusted my grinder, just brought the platen forward so that it gives me a larger slack belt area to work off of. And then I put my file guide back on. I just lined it up with the previous bevels. It keeps me from making a mistake. I do already have those bevels roughed in and could probably eyeball it on the edge of the belt, but didn't want to risk making any mistakes at this stage. So guide is back on, and I'm just going to use that and be swapping back and forth on the slack belt. Again, the belt is still going to be going the regular way, so I'll be swapping back and forth. It's not, it's not sharp yet. It's just a pointy thing. But I'm going to go ahead and get masked up and get going. So at this stage, you can see I blended those bevels pretty good. You see a little bit of faceting in there, and that will come out as we move up the grits as well. I'm doing this barehanded for several reasons, the primary of which is that it allows me to feel the temperature of the blade. And so as soon as I start feeling it getting hot from grinding is when I pull off, because I don't want to ruin my temper. And if it's hot to my finger, that means it's getting up towards ruining my temper. So yeah, at this point, I'm done with the 80 grit belt. I'm going to start sliding up to 120 and move up after that. Pretty happy with how this is looking. I've managed to blend in a lot of the those bevel facets that we're seeing at the last stage. I've also been managing to continue to take metal off as we get closer and closer to our center line here, keeping that even as we continue to remove steel from the overall blade width. So it's looking good. This was 120 grit. I'm going to move up to 220 grit at this point. So once I hit 220 grit, I actually like to get a little more active cooling while I'm grinding, and this is also when I like to switch my grinder into reverse. So the first thing I'm going to do, switch it into reverse, make sure the belt's tracking well, and I'm going to get my active cooling set up. All right, so I'm tracking all right in reverse. I bought one of these off of Amazon, and I'll link this in the description below, but this is one of the full sealed mist sprayers. It's used for oil lubricant. It comes with the hose you need for the water, and then you have to buy the fitting for your air compressor, as well as the hose that goes into it. These are all metric fittings, so it was a little annoying to get. I actually was fortunate enough that Brian House over at Housework sent me these when I got some knobs from him as well that you'll see in some future videos. So I'm going to go ahead and get this set up, and we'll get started. I don't know if you guys can make this out, but on that last pass, I'm actually getting what's called a wire on this opposite side, which is when you've actually hit the apex and you're folding the metal over the other side. You can kind of see it bending off my fingertip there. And ideally, you would hit that evenly throughout. I'm still not quite there right here, right next to the sharpening choil, but it's basically across the the rest of the length of the blade. So it's just back here that I'm not quite at the apex, and when I look down it, I'm still getting a little of flat reflective off that base. So at this grit, I'm probably going to spend a little bit more time trying to catch that heel up, hopefully without taking too much off of the rest of it. I might have to swap back to the hard platen to do that. I will say one warning on a system like this is that it is not a clean system. Just kind of putting metal dust with water everywhere. So if we look up here, you can see that kind of jagged edge that you see. That's the wire that I'm talking about, and that is what I was working to get all the way up to the sharpening choil. So we see that kind of all the way down the blade at this point. At this stage, I am I'm done with 220 grit. We've reached our apex, so I'm just going to take the finish of the blade up as high as I want it. I'm probably going to stop. This is 220. I have some plans for this knife. It's something I've never done before, so there might be some testing in there, but I think I'm going to stop at either 600 or 800. That's basically as high as my belt progression takes me. And we'll see how that turns out with how we'd like to finish the blade portion of this. So I will get the what's next? I'll get the 400 grit belt up on here, and we'll take it through the next stage. So there's a fairly common saying in the knife making world is that knife makers don't make mistakes, they just make shorter knives. Looks like I took the very tip of this knife to the point that it's not there anymore. So I'm going to spend a hot second just kind of reprofiling this a little bit. I'm going to bring my, my point or my curve down a bit more to meet the tip again, which was not my original design, but again, just make shorter knives. So this will be a slightly shorter knife. So I think I'm going to call it for the night. I'm noticing, I'm just making mistakes. I kind of shortened the knife a little bit one more time. It's maybe only a 1/16 of an inch, but I'm not happy with exactly how the profile is. I'm going to have to fix that again. The finish is actually looking pretty good. I'm happy with the 600 grit finish at this point. I'll come back tomorrow or the next time that I'm in the shop, and I will bring this up to an 800 grit after I reprofile that. And then I think I'm going to, once we hit 800 grit, I'm going to take it over to the ferric chloride. We're going to etch it, make it a nice dark blade, and then we'll move on to final sharpening. So when we left off last time, I had made the same mistake again where I had basically ground off the tip of my knife and was at a place where I needed to reprofile it. And after I made that mistake twice within close succession, I decided I was just too tired to continue grinding on it that night, and so I called it a night. I'm coming back today. I'm going to reprofile this blade, and then we're going to work up through our belt progression like we were doing last time. I'm going to start at 600 grit, move up to 800 grit, and then we'll move over to the acid etch. So I must have not cleaned the knife off very well when we were done filming last week. There were some rust that formed right where the blade stops and the handle begins, and my slack belt portion wasn't tight enough, or the belt was curling. Either way, I didn't have a crisp edge on the edge of the belt to continue to use that to clean up that area. So I swapped my platen around so that I can use it sort of as like a surface grind. Anyways, I'm using my hard platen backing so that I can make sure I can get into that corner and get that rust taken care of before we progress to the next belt. So I'm fairly happy with the 800 grit finish I've got now. I want to kind of blend some of those lines together, so I'm going to go to my extra fine surface conditioning belt. I'm going to go over the whole blade with that just to clear up any of the color that's back on the handle, as well as blend in any of the lines and kind of clear out any of those tempering colors or oxidization from the hardening process. Once we're done with that, everything should be a nice even color, and then we'll go into the acid tank. So at this point, I have cleaned the knife with denatured alcohol. The whole point is you want to get all the oils, all the grime, all of that off the blade, because that acts as a resist to the acid and will leave splotches and streaks and things like that, which we're trying to avoid. Just have it on a metal hanger, and then I'm going to drop it in here for probably around 10 minutes. So it's 8:50 now. Put this in. Make sure it's completely submerged, and then we'll bring you back in about 10 minutes. Stop. Right there. Don't lift it. So at this point, I have pulled it out of the ferric chloride. I neutralized with both Windex and baking soda water, and at this stage there's only a couple things left. That gave it a nice flat black appearance throughout, which is exactly what I was going for, but I want to highlight some of the depth and changes in elevation on the handle. So I'm going to go back to the grinder. I'm going to use my Scotch-Brite belt, or my Scotch-Brite belt, and just kind of hit those top sections real quick, being careful to avoid the blade. I'm probably going to tape up the blade so I don't hit it, because I want that to stay as black as possible. And that'll just bring out a lot of the depth changes that are in the handle. And then after that, the last step is going to be final sharpening. So all I did is just hit the handle and all the edges of the handle with the surface conditioning belt. And this just allowed me to kind of bring back that change in depth that the hammered finish gave us with the ball peen hammer, and really give some visual nuance and some beautiful chatoyance to the metal. All right, so that's going to be wrapping up this project. We did run into a couple of problems after the initial etch. The first etch turned out great, but when I was doing the final sharpening on the micro bevel, I slipped and hit the body of the blade and ended up scraping some of the etch off. So I went back up through the grits of belt progression and back into the etching, and it just didn't come out clean. We tried it 3 times and it still didn't come out really clean. I'm going to chalk this up to a learning experience, and the portions that didn't get etched are just going to blend in as the knife gets used and as it continues to patina over time. So now it's going to be the sharpness test. Let's go ahead and run it through this nice piece of printer paper. Looks like it has a little bit that might be able to be a little bit sharper, but I'm going to go ahead and call this done for, oh man, this keeps getting worse as I go farther. All right, so it needs a little bit more sharpening done to it, but I'm going to call this one finished for this project for today. We really appreciate all of you guys, our viewers. None of this would be possible without you. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. That helps support the channel. If you'd like to support the channel in other ways, you can head over to Patreon or Teespring to buy any of our t-shirts or other memorabilia. Also, there's Buy Me a Coffee. All of those will be linked in the description below. If you'd like to see what I'm doing outside of videos that we record, you can follow me over on Instagram at Crafting a Life I Want. Again, we just want to thank you for watching, and we'll hope to see you next time.